You know, this is one sermon that if you happen to fall asleep, I wouldn't be upset. I would just assume that you were listening and doing what I asked you to do. Today we're going to talk about sleep a little bit. What is sleep? Anyone who's ever suffered from insomnia is all too familiar with that question. You can't sleep all night and you wake up. Well, you don't wake up because you never fell asleep. You get dressed in the morning and you drag yourself to work, and there a coworker is almost bragging. Every time you can't sleep, it seems like somebody's got to tell you how much sleep they got. And so someone starts bragging about, oh, me and the missus, we went to bed at like 9 o'clock last night, and we went to sleep. And you're thinking, sleep? What is this sleep that you speak of? And so what is sleep? It's a great question. Sleep can be one of those elusive things that you know you want, but you can't seem to obtain. It's kind of like a unicorn or a phoenix. You've heard of them. You know what they look supposed to look like, but you don't know if they actually exist. In fact, you're pretty sure they don't. When I was a teenager, I'd go to my father's for the summer to stay. But it was a difficult adjustment trying to adjust to the new reality when I was just a young teenager of being a part of a broken home. And sometimes I found it very difficult to actually stay in my father's house, not because I didn't love him and not because he didn't love me. It was just, as I was trying to deal with the new adjustment, it was just hard all the time. And so what I did was I often found myself spending the night at a friend's house down the road. And I would spend most of the summers at their house and actually just visit my father. And so this particular family, they were a Christian family. They were very good to me. They fed me, and they really helped me through some of the more turbulent times in my life. In fact, as a teenager, when I re-surrendered my life to God, the mother of that family was able to tell before I ever spoke a word. Literally, I showed up that day, that summer for my visit. I showed up at my dad's about an hour later. I was at my friend's house. I walked through the door, and I never even said the word hello, and she looked at me and she said, "There's something different about you. Something's changed." I didn't have to tell her. She knew immediately, and I don't know how she knew, but I was so glad that she did. And anyway, while I was staying at her house, or at their house, trying to process everything, I found myself now stressed out by the fact that the realization that not only did my dad walk away from our family, but he also walked away from God. And having come back to God, I'm not new to this whole thing, and I understood what it meant to walk away from God. What it meant to say, I don't want anything to do with God, and the consequences of denying God. And as I was wrestling with that as a teenager, it would actually stress me out. I became overstressed by this idea that my dad was not right with God. And while I was wrestling with all that, the enemy kept trying to remind me of all the mistakes of my past, telling me that God couldn't love me, telling me that God couldn't use me, and all of this stuff. And I knew that it was a lie. But even though I knew it was a lie, when you hear something 1,000 times a day, at least that's what it felt like, it gets really hard to ignore, doesn't it? And so I'm wrestling with my dad's spiritual life. I'm wrestling with my own spiritual life. And right at the peak of my stress, I get a phone call from home. There was a pastor's wife that we had been praying for some time because she had cancer. And I received word that day that she had died from her cancer. And the result for me was insomnia. I went from getting 8 to 12 hours of sleep at night to something like 2 to 3 hours of sleep at night. Basically, I couldn't sleep until I literally passed out. And even then, I would only sleep long enough that my body would be able to regain consciousness. It was not a good thing. And this lasted for about 1 to 2 weeks. I had become physically, emotionally, and spiritually exhausted, which only added to the stress in my life and created this downward spiral where everything was circular. I couldn't sleep, so I was getting more stressed out, and because I was getting more stressed out, I couldn't sleep, and so on and so forth. And it was just a bad state that I found myself in, but I didn't want anyone to know. And so I tried really hard to keep it hidden. I tell lots of jokes, and I'd try to keep my energy levels up through the day. But inside, I was wiped out. One night, I was laying on the couch, and I was tired of laying there in silence with my eyes wide open, staring into the darkness. Because we were out in the country, there wasn't even any street lights. When it was dark, it was dark. And I remember I was laying there and I was just tired of laying in the darkness and in the silence of it all. And so I decided that I would get up, and the kitchen was quite a mess from the day before, and so I decided I'd wash the dishes. And so I washed all the dishes, and after I washed the dishes, I said, well, I might as well dry them and put them away. And so I dried them and put them away, and then I decided to sweep the floor, because what else was I going to do? And I tried to be really quiet because I didn't want to wake anyone up, because after all, it was 3 o'clock in the morning. And so I cleaned the entire kitchen, and then finally my body got so exhausted, I went and laid down on the couch, and about 5 o'clock in the morning I fell asleep, and at 6:30 in the morning I woke back up. And when the family came downstairs to discover their clean kitchen, they wondered where the elves were. Who cleaned the kitchen? They said. And for the first time in that trip, I finally explained to them that I hadn't been sleeping at night. The result led to many late night talks, support, and just people telling me how much they cared about me, and eventually the return of the elusive sleep. Sleep. What is sleep? The Hebrew word for sleep is, shachav. Hold on. You need a little more phlegm for that. Shachav. There we go. You got it. And it basically means to lie down, to lie asleep, or lie sick. And the root word, just in its simple form, this shachav, is found in the Old Testament 203 times by itself, just this root word shachav. And then it appears in other various forms in conjunction with other words 260 times. Now, sometimes the word was literal for sleep. Sometimes the word referred to someone who was lazy or sluggish, kind of in the same way that we would say, would you quit sleeping on the job and get to work? Chop, chop. You're kind of taking forever doing this thing. You're lazy today. You're acting like you're asleep, right? We use those same type of terms today. And sometimes it was very figurative in referring to someone who had died or who had become sick. And then there are all the other uses of the word shachav. And you can read those. I'm not going to read them all, but you can read some of those different uses of the word. And basically what I want you to understand is that much like today, this word can mean so many different things to different people, but what we need to understand is this concept of sleep. And when I say sleep, I actually mean sleep. Had teenagers one time ask me, is it wrong for teenagers to sleep together? And I said, what do you mean by sleep? Because if you mean sleep, go to sleep. The problem is y'all don't sleep. And so when I say sleep, we're talking about literal, lay your head on a pillow, or if you're Jacob, lay your head on a rock. How is that a suitable pillow? Who's laying on the ground and goes, man, this ground's awful hard. I wish I had a rock to lay my head on. Man, anyway. Laying on a pillow, closing your eyes, and going to sleep. What's important for us to know here is that sleep is important. Shoot, even Jesus slept. Even during some pretty interesting times and places. Sleep is a critical part of the human experience. That they say that a healthy night's sleep is somewhere between 6 to 8 hours, depending on you and your body and your needs. 6 to 8 hours of sleep a night. That's what they would consider a healthy guide. If we use the 8-hour mark as our guide, then what we are saying is that a person should try to sleep for 1/3 of their day. If there's 24 hours in a day, 8 hours is 1/3 of that. And if you do that day after day, what we're saying is a person ought to be sleeping 1/3 of their life. Think about it. If you were able to sleep for 8 hours exactly every night, every day of your life, by the time you are 75 years old, you will have slept for 25 of those 75 years. Now, the reality is, we don't always get 8 hours of sleep at night. Sometimes we get 12 hours. Sometimes we get 4 or less hours. Sometimes we're working with young people, and so we pull an all-nighter because young people like staying up all night. Apparently that's enjoyable to them. And so you get 0 hours of sleep. Sometimes you suffer from insomnia, but the reality is, regardless of how much sleep we get, it's almost like our bodies were designed for sleep. Would you agree with that? We need a certain amount of sleep just to be healthy. And it's a big chunk of our lives is actually dedicated just for sleep. Oh, the elusive sleep. My son sleeps with this. He sleeps on it. It's like a huge mattress for him. It's bigger than he is. It's super comfy. Makes me want to fall asleep. A few years back, I took a course on chaplaincy for the fire service. And as part of that course, I learned something very interesting. Now, before I tell you what I learned, I need you to understand I am not a psychologist. I am not a psychiatrist. And so what I'm going to tell you is what I remember as being described to me and how I remember being taught it. So if there are some psychologists or psychiatrists who are listening and you're like, that's not exactly right, it's close but not quite, please understand I'm not claiming to be an expert in this area. This is just what I remember being taught. But it was very interesting to me because I learned that sleep actually helps us to process information and convert short-term memories into long-term memories. If you have ever watched someone sleep while they were sleeping, you're super creepy. That's just weird. Sit there and stare at someone while they're sleeping, that's not right. But if you were to watch someone sleep, what you would discover is that when they reach what we call REM sleep, their eyes start twitching underneath their eyelids. Have you ever seen that? Any super creepy people in the room? I'm one. I've watched people sleep. Anyone who's ever been married, if your spouse falls asleep before you, you've probably seen the eye twitchy thing. Right? In fact, that's why we call it REM sleep. The word REM stands for rapid eye movement. And this is happening in part because the brain is actually sorting the events of the day and is taking the events of the day and transferring them from short-term memory into long-term memory, and your eyes actually go back and forth as the information transfers back and forth. It's really interesting and really weird. And super creepy. Not just if you're watching someone, but super creepy to watch. Their eyes are just going blah, 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 blah. Anyway, it's very fun. Find someone who's asleep and just stare at them. It's really fun. All right. Especially if they wake up, they scream. It's awesome. All right. Now, without getting too technical, this is the part I wanted to share with you. The problem with those who have experienced traumatic events that have caused them so that they can't sleep at night. What ends up happening is one of the side effects of that trauma is insomnia. And because they're not sleeping, the images and the memories of the event of that day remain in their short-term memory instead of being transferred to their long-term memory, which causes interruptive images to pop up. It causes flashbacks to happen because the information is still fresh. It could be weeks, months later, but in their mind, it had just happened that day. It's still in their short-term memory. And so, which is a part of the reason that people with struggle with PTSD suffer from these reoccurring images and flashbacks. At least that's my understanding as it was explained to me. So if that's not 100% accurate, please forgive me, but that's how it was explained to me. And part of the problem is, because of this lack of sleep, they're never able to convert those memories from short-term to long-term, or to essentially put the issue to bed, figuratively and literally. And so, when you put it to bed and you move it to short or to long-term memory, what that does is it makes it so you can recall the memory at your choice. It's like taking it from the desktop of your computer where it's just always up and moving it into a file bank in your computer so that down the road, if you need to recall that file, you can go search for it and open it and bring it back out. But it's not like it's on your desktop all the time. But when it's in your short-term memory, it's just always right there in your face. And they've never been able to move it over into the long term. And I know that that's a pretty simplistic explanation, and there's a lot more to it than that. So please, please, please don't go performing experiments on your loved ones based on that information. But there's a technique that's being used to actually help people who have witnessed traumatic events. They're asked to follow an item with their eyes. Now, it could be the counselor's finger or a pen, whatever it is. And while they're following that item with their eyes, what they are asked to do is to describe the event, the traumatic event, in great detail. Talk about the smells. Talk about what you saw, what you heard, what you tasted. Talk about how it made you feel, the facts and everything. Just unload it. Everything you can remember about that event, just blah, and just speak it out. And while they're describing the event in great detail, the counselor or whoever's doing the exercise will move the object back and forth quite rapidly, and you follow it with your eyes. And what they're trying to do is simulate that rapid eye movement, because what they've discovered is that they can actually jumpstart that process of moving events from the short term into the long term memory by simulating that rapid eye movement. Doesn't work every time, but there have been cases where it's actually helped people move from a state of trauma or stress response into a place where they can find rest and peace and eventually sleep again. Isn't that awesome? Now, as in everything, there's always a risk, and one of the risks here is that you could possibly re-traumatize a person, and so things like this should be left up to professionals and not done by yourself. But it's interesting to see just how sleep can help us to process information. Sleep is essential to the human experience, right? Whether you understand what's going on while you're sleeping or not, sleep is essential to the human experience. Other studies have shown that prolonged stress can develop sleeping disorders, from not being able to sleep to not being able to stay awake. Sleeping too much. Interestingly enough, though, the same study teaches us that one of the best stress management tools in our toolbox is healthy sleep habits. Which explains why mothers with babies who do not sleep through the night are often stressed out. It also explains why today, the fifth and final stress management tool that I want to give you as part of Hanging On by a Thread series that we're in is sleep. Sleep is a stress management tool. Not that you should sleep for 24 hours a day, but healthy sleep patterns can actually help you cope and deal with the events of the day and the events of your life, and help you to find rest and recover from stress response. And it can actually lower that stress baseline that we're talking about. People who don't get enough sleep, they are at the brink. They're not even a lost sock away from losing it. They are like a cool breeze away from losing it. I mean, they're just right there all the time. There's nothing that they can do. If you're not getting enough sleep, you are at a constant state of burnout and stress. Right? Anyone here ever suffer from insomnia? Know what I'm talking about? You've been there, right? And so the question becomes, how can you develop healthy sleep patterns? Because we know the issue is, we all know that. We know that sleep is helpful in this area. What we don't know is, how do you get sleep when sleep is trying to elude you? When sleep seems like the unicorn that doesn't really exist? How do you get sleep? And that's the question I want to try to answer today. How can you develop healthy sleep patterns when you feel stressed out? To answer this question, I want to look at Psalm chapter 3. Now, while you are turning in your Bibles to Psalm chapter 3, I want you to notice how that psalm starts. It says, a psalm of David regarding the time David fled from his son Absalom. Now, what this does for us is it helps us to put this psalm in its historical context. And so what that tells us is that David wrote this psalm during the time when he had to flee from Absalom because Absalom was trying to take or seize power. And so you can find this story, if you want to read it in your Bibles, in 2 Samuel chapter 15, verses 13 to 37. And while you're turning, let me just kind of give you the highlights of what you need to know. So, David is no longer the young boy who killed Goliath. He has gotten older. He is no longer near the beginning of his kingship. Now he's nearing the end of his reign as king over Israel. He's getting older, he's getting sicker, and the time has come for him to name a successor, whom he would eventually name as Solomon, the son that was born to him by Bathsheba. Obviously not the son that they lost, but the one after that. And so that's who David wants to succeed him as king. But he has another son whose name is Absalom. And Absalom decides that he should be king. He's older, he's wiser, he's stronger. And so Absalom gathers support from different people in different tribes and communities, and he approaches the city of Jerusalem, and as he's heading towards the city, word is given back to David of Absalom's plot and the sheer number of support that he's acquired and what's going to happen. And so to protect the people who supported him and to keep the city from being destroyed by war, King David declares eviction, and he tells everyone who supports him, get out of the city. And David and his family and his servants and everyone who supported him fled from the city of Jerusalem. David left only a few concubines to take care of the palace, and they fled. Now, here he is being hunted by one of his own sons because his son wants to claim or seize power. Interestingly enough, David's reign as king started as he fled for his life from Saul, whose family had been rejected by God. And now it seems as if his reign will end much in the same way as it started. Do you think that David was stressed at all? Do you think that maybe, just maybe, David might have had a hard time sleeping at night out of fear that he might be killed? Let's read and find out. O Lord, I have so many enemies. So many are against me. So many are saying God will never rescue him. But you, O Lord, are a shield around me. You are my glory, the one who holds my head high. I cried out to the Lord, and he answered me from his holy mountain. I lay down and slept. Yet I woke up in safety, for the Lord was watching over me. I am not afraid of the 10,000 enemies who surround me on every side. Arise, O Lord, rescue me, my God. Slap all my enemies in the face. Shatter the teeth of the wicked. Victory comes from you, O Lord. May you bless your people. You ever want to ask God to slap somebody in the face for you? David did. I love that boldness. Slap them in the face, God. Knock out their teeth. Make them look like Gumby. The question today is, how can you develop healthy sleep patterns when you're stressed out? I'm going to try and fly through this last bit. But I could sit here for hours and talk to you about healthy sleep habits, like go to sleep at the same time every night and wake up at the same time every morning. It helps your body to become conditioned and used to when you sleep, when you wake. So when the time comes for bed, your body's already ready for bed because it's been conditioned. So set those habits early. We could talk about turning off the TVs and the smartphones and the tablets because those screens are sleep stealers. In fact, my wife told me she read an article the other day that said you need to turn off all the screens in your house 2 hours before you're ready to go to bed because it takes that long for your mind to recover from all of the light and movement that it's taken in throughout the day before it's ready to actually settle down and sleep. So those of you who are like me and say, well, I sleep better when the TV's on, the truth is you might fall asleep faster, but you don't sleep better. Your mind never enters fully into that rest mode. And so turn off the screens. And I could talk about all of these practical things to help you develop sleep habits, but what we're talking about here isn't just developing healthy sleep patterns. It's about how do you develop those healthy sleep patterns when you're stressed out. When it feels like you can't get to sleep because there's just too much going on in your life and you have all these things just constantly running through your head and it's bombarding you from every side and your mind can't shut off because you're too worried about everything that is going on. How do you sleep? And I believe the answer that we found in the passage we just read is that we need to find rest in the one who is watching over you. Find rest in the one who's watching over you. I couldn't decide what story to share with you today. There was the time where my friend and I slept through the night, even though there was a lunatic holding my pregnant sister at knife point in the downstairs in the same house. Or there was the time more recently when I slept fully convinced that I was not going to wake up the next morning. I decided to share the second story with you, and so if you want to hear the first story, keep coming to church. I'm sure it'll come up again eventually. It's an interesting story for sure. About two and a half years ago, right at the peak of my anxiety, and I've shared before with you that I've struggled with anxiety in the past, and right at the peak of my anxiety, I had this pain in the back of my neck, and eventually my whole head went numb. And I was already entirely anxious. I was worried about absolutely everything and nothing at the same time. And I didn't understand what was going on. And so my mind began to race with all of the different possibilities. And I did the worst thing a person could possibly do in that situation. I went online and I typed my symptoms into Google. And the first website that came up was a very popular web doctory type site. And it said, very accurately, I might add, that what you are most likely suffering from is a tension headache. But I wasn't satisfied with that answer because I said, I'm not stressed. That doesn't make any sense to me at all. And so I kept reading down through the list. I should have stopped at tension headache. Because eventually I got to the item in the list that said, or it could be tumors on your spine pressing on a nerve. And I wasn't long closing the computer after that. And it took me about 5 minutes to convince myself that I was dying. In fact, I had convinced myself so fully that I was dying that I convinced myself that I was going to go to sleep and I wasn't going to wake up in this earth, but that I would be with the Lord. I believed it with all my heart that I was dying. In fact, I told my wife before I went to sleep, I said, if I wake up in the morning, I'm going to call and make an appointment with the doctor. And I laid down and I went to sleep. And what's really interesting is that I was actually able to sleep. Thinking I wouldn't wake up, I laid down and I went to sleep. And the reason I was able to sleep, believing with all my heart that I was going to die, was because I knew that regardless of what was going on in my body, whether I live or whether I die is in the hands of God. And not only is my life in His hands, the life of my family is in His hands. Therefore, I was able to fall asleep knowing that the one who was watching over me was bigger than whatever it was I was facing. So not only was I able to sleep, I woke up the next morning and surprise, surprise, my headache was gone. And I could feel my head again. There's a stupid song out there that says, I can't feel my face when I'm with you. I can never feel my face. The reason I was freaked out is because I could feel my face. It was all tingly, and it didn't feel right. But I woke up and I was fine. I still made the doctor's appointment. And I kept the doctor's appointment, and I'm glad I did. In fact, it turns out I was just in stress response, and my doctor knew it right away. I was having an anxiety attack and didn't realize it. But thanks to my faith in God, not only was I able to sleep, but in the morning the headache was gone. I still made the appointment because I cannot stress this enough. If ever you have convinced yourself that you're dying, go to the hospital. Because either you're dying and you need to go to the hospital, or you're not dying and you still need to talk to somebody. All right? See, what keeps us up at night is when we are afraid or worried about the problems and circumstances of our life. We look at our problems and they seem so big and so overwhelming, and we are all we can focus on is that it's going to ruin our life somehow. It's going to destroy us somehow, and it just runs through your head constantly, over and over and over again, and it keeps you from resting to the point that even if you fall asleep, your dreams are so intense that you wake up and feel even more tired than when you went to sleep because you never really entered rest. You know, all you wanted to do was sleep, and now you got to make a go-kart with your landlord, and you're like, oh, I'm so tired, I just want to sleep. Because often what we fail to remember is that no matter how big or how bad our problems might get, the God who watches over us is bigger. That's how David was able to sleep. Even though he was being hunted by his own son. Look at verse 5. It says, I lay down and slept. I laid down and slept. He's being hunted by his own son, yet he was able to lay down and sleep, for the Lord was watching over me. Yet I woke up in safety, for the Lord was watching over me. See, David knew that God was on his side. He knew that God was in control, and even if Absalom killed him, God would still be in control. Why should I stay awake and worry when I can sleep knowing that the God who created the heavens and the earth is watching over me? The reason David could sleep was because he let go of fear and anxiety and left the situation in the God who is bigger than any problem or combinations of problems he might have. And David's not the only example of this in the Bible. Daniel slept in the den of hungry lions. Paul slept in prison. Jesus slept in the bow of a small boat during a raging storm. Joseph slept in prison for many years after being falsely accused of a crime he didn't commit. Peter also slept in prison and was woken up by an angel. Jacob slept the night before meeting his brother, who had vowed to kill him if he ever saw him again. And what do all these stories teach us? Quite simply, no matter how bad things might get, you can always get a good night's sleep, knowing that God is watching over you. Even when we're stressed to the max, may we find rest and sleep, knowing that God is bigger than the boogeyman. So where do we go from here? What's the next step? I'm going to play a song that you've probably heard before. Maybe if you've ever watched VeggieTales, you've heard it before. And as you listen to that song, I just want you to remember just who it is that's watching over you. Who is protecting you? Who is on your side? Because if God is for us, who can stand against us? And then tonight, as you lay down to go to sleep, I'd encourage you to stop. Take a deep breath. In through your nose, out through your mouth. In through your nose, out through your mouth. It's amazing how many people we have to teach how to breathe. You take a good deep breath and you pray and you remember that no matter what happens while you're sleeping, God is watching over you. Well, hopefully, if you didn't listen to me, you'll at least listen to VeggieTales. I think the Bible is the ultimate authority. Then VeggieTales is just somewhere a little lower down on the list, I hope that you'll sleep well. Sleep is essential to the human experience. And at the end of the day, God is with you, and He cares for you. And no matter how much stress comes into your life, no matter what you're dealing with, building a house, I know, can be stressful. Family can be stressful. Work can be stressful. All that stuff can stress us out. You know God's bigger than all of it. And He's watching out for you and me. Let's pray. God, thank you so much for your word, and thank you that we have such a good God who's watching over us. God, I pray that each person who listens to this sermon, whether now in this room or on video later, God, I pray that they would find rest. Not rest in their bank account, not rest in their circumstances, but rest in knowing that regardless of any of that other stuff, you, O Lord, are bigger, and you're watching out for them. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. I want to thank you for watching our video. I really hope that there was something in there that you were able to find helpful, that you could apply to your life. I'd encourage you to feel free to leave a comment down below. Let us know if there's a Bible passage or a topic that you're hoping that we'll cover in a future sermon. If you're ever in the Hartland, New Brunswick area or Woodstock, New Brunswick area, please look us up. We're halfway between Hartland and Grafton on the Route 105. Want to make sure you're following us on Facebook, facebook.com/Lower Brighton Wesleyan. And I want you to always remember, we are stronger together.